everyone. My name is Khando Langri. As I said earlier, I'm half Tibetan, half Quebecer. Right now I'm a student at McGill University studying anthropology and political science, and today I'm going to talk to you about my project, which involves taking Tibetan Sign Language and disseminating it into the exiled Tibetan community. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about where this interest came from. When I was 10 years old, I was diagnosed with degenerative sensory neural hearing loss, which is a mouthful. And it's not that scary though, and I've worn hearing aids ever since. But until the summer of 2016, when I went to India, and I happened to meet a relative who was also hard of hearing and deaf, I had considered my identity as a disabled person to be entirely separate from my identity as a Tibetan person. I associated that identity with my white mother, and kept it separate from my Tibetan heritage. So this meeting kind of got me thinking about what does it mean to be a Tibetan? What does it mean to be disabled Tibetan in exile? So through that, I've kind of been rethinking the spaces I've been navigating that are associated with disability and the ways we think about disabled bodies in a sanitized Western context versus third world disabled bodies that are associated with poverty or sickness. So, through my project, I've kind of come across some general observations about linguistic hierarchies that are in place and continuously maintained, and just people feed into them unwittingly. So, for example, when I talk to people about my research on Tibetan Sign Language, their first reaction is usually that of surprise, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. They usually say right off the bat, "I thought there was only one sign language that all deaf people spoke." So, and that's just, and it's not with ill intent, it's just something that they've come to internalize through these linguistic hierarchy that kind of, ensures that sign language is perceived as something purely utilitarian rather than something that is full of nuances that even oral languages cannot even attempt to replicate. So this is, and this is like probably ties back to the fact that through media and just through academia, sign language is seen as being something that's very top-down, that's taught to deaf people by non-deaf people, rather than a grassroots phenomenon, which has always been. So, and then I kind of started thinking about, in Tibetan Buddhism, our own relationship to silence and signs, and something I came across in my research is the fact that there's a Buddha called the Pratikya Buddha, who is a Buddha who does not communicate at all, and he communicates with his disciples solely through sign language and complete silence. And this comes from the idea that there are some higher truths that cannot be communicated through language, spoken language, due to its limitations. So when you take this linguistic hierarchy and just these beliefs in Buddhism, like, I find them completely irreconcilable. So I've just kind of been diving into these two different aspects. And the project itself, I'm not sure if most of you know about the Tibetan struggle. I'll break it down very fast. In 1950, the Chinese People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet and annexed the entire Tibetan plateau and deemed it to have been a part of ancestral China since forever. And since that time, the 14th Dalai Lama fled into India and was followed by about 80,000 Tibetans. And since then, the largest exile community has flourished in Dharamsala, a city in the northern part of India. So, and meanwhile, back in Tibet, Tibetan Sign Language was developed in the early 2000s. And however, given the fact that Tibet is a very repressed place and is actually considered to be one of the least free places in the world, it has yet to disseminate into exile. So I've been in contact with the only scholar who's been to Tibet and helped develop the sign language, and she's kind of like, through her works and her dictionary that should be arriving any day now, I've kind of like just been blown away by these signs that are just indicative of our shared past and the way it affects our present. I'm not really conveying it properly, but for example, one sign, the sign for Chinese in Tibetan Sign Language is made by motioning the front of the head in order to designate a military cap, because like the ones that were worn in 1951 during the invasion of Tibet and the continued military presence in Tibet. So that's how deaf Tibetans perceive Chinese people, and how anyways, I just find it incredibly amazing. I'll stop mumbling about that. And also, like, the sign for Tibetan is the sign for tsampa, this traditional Tibetan dish, and the sign for eater. So I just think it's great. And all this babbling is just to kind of tell you guys that within this gap, there's this huge potential for exile-specific signs that Tibetan Sign Language has yet to profit from because of this gap between our two communities. And this kind of plays into the opportunity that Tibetan Sign Language has to both empower and enfranchise deaf Tibetans both inside Tibet and outside Tibet, and create ultimately a deaf Tibetan diaspora which would transcend the cultural and the spatial dislocation associated with exile. So this all sounds very good, but how do I do that concretely? Well, right now, my long-term plan is to build durable networks of information sharing between Tibetans outside Tibet and Tibetans inside Tibet. This would be done through academia, because that is the easiest way of information sharing right now in Tibet. And ideally, this would give way to educational packet, which would be distributed to schools for deaf Tibetans in India. Because right now these children, although the Central Tibetan Administration has, I'm done. Anyways, I could keep talking about this forever, but ultimately what I am trying to do with this huge project that is too big for me is to move away from the medicalized definition of disability that's taken root in not only the Tibetan community, but most communities out there, and just move towards a place where we're comfortable with being both disabled and a person of color and a person in exile and a refugee. So all those things together. So thank you for listening to me.